Intersection Observer. What the hell is it, when to use it, and how to use it? Let's take a look. Devs, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Derick. I'm a front-end developer based out of Los Angeles, California, and in today's video, I'm going to be going over one of the more modern APIs in JavaScript, and that is Intersection Observer. So what is it, and when should you use it? Well, Intersection Observer is mostly used if you want to detect when an element enters the viewport and then have something happen when it does. The two most common cases for this are typically lazy loading images and triggering animations on elements when they enter the viewport. In the past, we've had this guy, Old Faithful, our old pal, Emergence.js. If you wanted to give yourself a dynamic hook on page elements when they enter the viewport and then do something with them, Emergence was typically your go-to library. And that's because it's simple, lightweight, and good for small projects, and pretty easy to implement. Just drop the JS file in your project, point to it with a script tag, initialize things, and then append the element you want to detect with an emergence attribute, and you're pretty much good to go. But we don't have to do that anymore because element detection is now baked into JavaScript with the Intersection Observer API. And it actually has a few advantages over our old pal Emergence.js. And the first one is native performance optimizations. It offloads visibility calculations to the browser. The second is customizable thresholds. So say you only want something to happen to an element when it only partially enters the viewport, say 50% of it, for example. You can do that, and that's pretty handy. And last is that it works with asynchronous processing and reduces CPU load. But what the hell does that mean? That just basically means that the Intersection Observer API lets the browser handle the heavy lifting of checking if something is visible in the viewport or not. That's pretty much it. So our boy Emergence, our old friend, it had a good run. There's nothing wrong with still using Emergence.js, but if you want to stick to writing more modern JavaScript without the reliance of third-party library code, and you just want to utilize more of JavaScript's latest baked-in goodies, stick with Intersection Observer. But hey, that's a quick overview. Now let's hop into our editor and take a look at how we can actually use it. All right, so we have our editor here, code on the left, web view on the right, and I've got this container with the text hello world. And if I scroll in my container, we have three very faded out images right now, and I want to use Intersection Observer to basically lazy load these in when they enter the viewport. So this will be our starting point. We'll just take a quick look at our HTML, super basic HTML template here. We have our hello world heading and then those three images you just saw. Linking to an external style sheet, that's this guy here, just some very, very basic styles to set up the page. And when Intersection Observer works its magic and appends a dynamic hook to these image elements, basically CSS is going to take over from that point. And you can see they start with an opacity of 0.15, which is basically nothing. And then it's going to append a visible class to them once they enter the viewport and set their opacity to fully visible at a 1. So JavaScript using Intersection Observer is going to append that dynamic hook, and then CSS takes over after that to style them so that we can see them in the viewport. We're linking to our scripts here at the bottom, and here is our script, empty scripts, great place to start. Let's go. All right, so right out the gate, we're just going to see if things are wired up correctly. I'm just going to paste in a quick console.log here, and you can see in our console, we get our message. So things are wired up, things are good to go. And the elements on the page that I want to detect or observe are going to be, of course, our images. So let's just get a quick reference to those, and I'll quickly paste this in, const images. We're going to do a query selector all, and we're going to target all of the image tags with the class lazy image. Now, the next piece for Intersection Observer is its options, and that's going to look like this. You can kind of think of these of the settings of our Intersection Observer and how it behaves on those detected elements once they enter the viewport. And since we want to use the viewport as our origin, it is common practice to just get root null. This is just going to use the viewport as the main container for detecting those elements. And now the next observer option we want, or setting, if you will, is going to be the root margin, and we're going to start that at 0. This is sort of the bounding box of when the element detection occurs. And by setting this to 0, it's going to start detecting elements at the very base of the viewport. We're basically just not going to give it any specified padding on the bounding box. We want Intersection Observer to observe or fire the second things enter the viewport, or in this case, the bounding box, as soon as they do. So I'm going to leave this at 0. And then the next piece is going to be the threshold. This will basically trigger when 50% of that element has entered the viewport. In this case, it's the images. So we have our faint faded images here. They're 500 by 400, but when they get about halfway, so right about there, that's when Intersection Observer will fire on those elements, append that dynamic class, and then, like I mentioned earlier, CSS will kick in and and load those images in. Next up, we need to define a new intersection observer. So we'll say const observer is going to equal a new intersection observer. Intersection observer takes a callback function and we'll set the parameters of entries and observer. And at the end of our intersection observer declaration, this is where we pass in the options. So we can say observer options right here. So we've got our observer skeleton. Well, now what? Whatever we want to observe, that's going to be our entries. So we can just take entries and we're going to loop over that with a for each. And for each entry, do something, but only if said entry is actually in the viewport and being observed. And we can check for that with a simple conditional. So let's get a simple if block going here. And if the entry is intersecting, take the entry's target class list and add a class. And we'll call this class visible. And then immediately after that, we want to just kill the observer. We just want to stop it. So we can say observer.unobserve. Unobserve is a method. What do we want to unobserve? We want to observe the entry.target. Yeah, so stop observing once the animation runs. Just stop. Okay, so this is great. This is basically set up at this point. We have our intersection observer defined with its settings, its observe options. So now how do we trigger it on our elements, on our images that we're referencing here? Well, we have our reference to all of our images. So we can just take images, come down here, simply loop over those with a for each. And since images is plural, we'll just call our items here image. So for each image, do something. And now we want to utilize our observer function here, our observer definition. So take images for each image, grab the observer and just hit it with the observe method. And what do we want to observe? Well, the image. And this should be it. So now if we come to our web view and scroll about halfway through these images, they should come full into view. And we do, we get that effect. CSS basically takes over at that point. We get to the next one. And the next one, perfect. So I'm gonna refresh this, and to really see how this is working under the hood, we can come to our second one here. Let's inspect it. And you can see we have our first one. It got appended the class visible, but the second one isn't there yet. But as the second one comes into view, we get that dynamic hook, right? It dynamically appends the class visible, and then CSS just takes over at that point and styles it to 100% opacity. And there you get your kind of lazy loaded effect. So this is now technically working. Now this only ever fires once because I have the unobserved here once that visible class is appended. But in order to observe that element infinitely and basically have it load in when it enters the viewport and then load out when it exits the viewport to sort of have like a back and forth type of effect, we can simply append an else clause here to our if statement. And then we want to just nuke the unobserved. Let's just basically turn it off. It'll gray out here in our parameters, but that's okay. We're just not using it. And all our else clause is going to say is just when it leaves the viewport, remove the visible class, and then it will go back to 0.15% opacity. So yes, just remove the class when the element leaves the viewport. That's it. So now I'll scroll. We'll get our fade in, our lazy load in, but then as it exits, it fades out, but then the next one fades in, and so on. So kind of a cool effect, but that is something that you could do too. But I only ever want this to fire once, so I'm going to turn this back on, and that's it. It's looking pretty good. So that's about it. Also, I will link the code down in the description, so feel free to check that out. In the world of front-end dev, in my opinion, Intersection Observer is the preferred choice for detecting element visibility in the viewport. It's just got better performance, flexibility, and native support in most browsers, so you really can't go wrong with it. But that's it, devs. That's going to do it for this one. Hopefully y'all found this one helpful. If you did, like the video, feel free to leave a comment or not. But as always, if you want to support the channel, all you have to do is